This is a production of Cornell University.
Can I just, actually you'll see that this talk is closely related to Delia's completely by serendipity. And where do we? I want to say one thing though that struck me in Delia's talk, which is, let's say that this meeting was occurring in 100 years ago, and we were predicting social science for the 20th century. I very much doubt that we would have thought of game theory, prisoner's dilemma, collective action. This has been one of the great steps forward conceptually for social science generally. And we are so accepting of this that actually we don't appreciate really the extent to which social sciences generally have made some very significant steps forward. So again, the idea simply conceptually of what we mean by a prisoner's dilemma situation and by the tragedy of the commons and collective action, these are all relatively new ideas that I think are now broadly accepted, easily taught across the social sciences. And the issue is to what extent can we look, as Delia has done, at sort of the granularity of this? How does it work specifically in different situations? So I think we ought to pat ourselves on the back a little bit occasionally that we've made some progress. Okay. Now, I want to talk about, I didn't anticipate this, that I would be overlapping so much with Delia, but let's go. I apologize if I'm saying things that are just ridiculous and naive. I want to put up this quote, which is a truly remarkable quote. Every person is to act as an individual only in entire independence of all other persons. Frank Knight actually said that in his famous book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And then the further thing, it's even worse. You know, it gets worse as it goes on, right? All of the things that we in this room think of as relevant to human motivation, he has ruled out. And I want to emphasize this because Knight, of course, was one of the great founders of the Chicago School of Economics. And Chicago has, until quite recently, insisted that price theory, which is really what this is saying, is it. Pretty much the main game here is to explain behavior in terms of reactions to market prices. It's not as if other things aren't there, but pretty much we're going to ignore them. The action is in getting the prices right, and then people will behave accordingly. This was a doctrine which still quite a few people there in the department believe, and I think you can see it here, this precursor in Knight's statement. Across the board in economics, it ain't so. And for example, take this statement of Kenneth Arrow, by the way, in an article which I think is a spectacularly interesting article. I urge it on everybody, this one here in the American Economic Review. But what he argues there is that every economic model actually embeds in one way or another social principles and concepts. This whole idea that you can reduce everything to individual, self-interested behavior and then end up talking about markets and equilibrium, it just doesn't work. You have to have some notion of social construction to make all of these things actually hang together logically. And, I urge you to read that article to see what he's talking about. The whole idea of equilibrium is fundamentally a social concept. Now, I want to just say a couple of things about rational actor models, which some people bemoan have taken over the social sciences. I actually take a somewhat different view of this. I think the narrow view of rationality, which unfortunately still is the dominant view within the economics profession, that is slowly being eroded, but it's pretty slow. Behavioral economics, some of the categories that Delia was talking about, altruism, experiments. Think of Ernst Fehr and his colleagues doing all range of experiments that have to do with trust, dictator games, link that with neuroscience, hormones. You know, you measure hormone levels and you look at behavior in a game. All of this is coming into economics. It's pretty gradual. It's all about then the question of how do you interpret rationality, which I think is the key here. So if we enlarge the notion of human motivation to include some of the categories which sociologists and psychologists take for granted, then I think a lot of these models are fine. But this is a tricky business, and economists are not terribly well grounded in making those nuanced measurements, for sure, or even putting them properly into their models. Now, I got interested in all of this because of studying social norms and the evolution of social norms. This is a topic which, of course, also ranges across the social sciences, and I've been struck by how differently economics, sociology, political science to some degree, and philosophy for that matter, all view this category, this set of problems, social norms or set of behaviors, and sort of look at them a little bit differently. I've tried to back up from this and try to get at a bare bones description of what I think is going on here. And I assume some sociologists probably will start barking about this. But at any rate, to me, a social norm is a regularity of behavior that is self-enforcing at the level of the group. There's some sense in which people want to conform when they expect others to conform. Now, notice what I left out of that description. I did not say what the mechanism was. I did not say what the motive to conform was. And this is where I think too many claims have been made and too many categories and lines drawn which are not terribly helpful. For example, saying that you need to fear sanctioning, that is outright punishment from members of the group if you deviate. Well, that might be true, but it's not true in all cases. So really we're just saying in game theoretic terms, the norms and equilibrium of a game, yes, and I haven't said what defines the payoffs that make it this way. Here's a very quick list of things which sort of give you a sense of the range of motivations and sanctions that might be applied to different kinds of conformity-producing situations. Outright punishment, I mean physical punishment for violating, say, community religious taboos. Just a loss of status. You just don't look good when you ignore a challenge to a duel in 18th century France. But you look like a fool if you accepted a challenge today. Think of the US politicians wearing these darn flag lapel pins. That's a wonderful modern example of a very subtle phenomenon, which is not outright sanctioning, actually. It involves something more akin to language, that wearing the lapel pin is now like saying something. If you don't say it, you now become misinterpreted. It's become a form of communication, either to wear it or not to wear it, and therefore you will be misunderstood, usually in a negative way, if you don't wear the pin, and so forth. So if we back up from the specific motivations and ask ourselves, is there anything interesting that can be said about these kinds of processes? I believe there is. There is, in all of these cases, whether you take a sort of direct sanctioning mechanism or just a conformity motive, there is basically, the idea is there's a positive feedback loop from group to individual behavior, and this in itself is interesting. So higher frequency of the behavior in the reference group somehow increases the incentive for the individual to follow it, and you get this sort of feedback process. So I have in my work, I won't go through the details here, charted this out in terms of stochastic dynamical systems theory. Now we can bring some mathematics to bear on this and talk about, well, what happens in a system like this exactly? And what if we write down the payoffs in a certain way? Can we say something about the type of equilibrium that will be selected in a coordination game, for example? Turns out the answer is yes. One of the interesting points about all this is that norms evolve without top-down direction. Typically, there's some role for leadership, but very often this is a sort of a bottom-up process. And we usually mean that norms apply in games or situations with multiple equilibria. And therefore, actually, what we see is different groups under fairly similar circumstances will, in fact, solve that coordination problem using norms that are differently constructed. And we can see that observationally. So those are some of the broad predictions of the theory. I simply am not going to waste your time with going into the mathematics or details of this. But I would argue that norms are perfectly rational from the individual's point of view if you simply take a sufficiently broad view of human motivation, not Knight's view. If you take Knight's view that the only thing that matters are market dealings and market prices, then I think you're stuck. You're stuck in a very silly and restricted corner. And by the way, I don't even think Knight himself believed this. But you'll have to read Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit to see what I've done here as a typical politician's trick of pulling out of context a statement. He did make those statements, but really what he was saying was, here are the assumptions we will have to make in order to make price equilibrium theory work. But then, of course, as inevitably happens in these cases, the disciples move on and just say, well, this is how people behave, right? Evolutionary game theory can be brought to bear on all of this. So let's see, how much time do I have? I don't want to.
Yeah, well, we're under 5 minutes, so you can
keep going for another
2 or 3. That's good.
2 or 3? Oh my God! Oh, I have to speed up. I just wanted to give a couple of examples from my one from my own work, one from demographer's work, very quickly. To show what I would mean by sort of how do you apply all of this in a, quote, real case. Well, I studied principal-agent contracts in agriculture, and these are extremely important, actually, in U.S. agriculture as well as in developing countries. These are so-called share contracts, half for you, half for me. We'll take the bushels at the end of the harvest, and, you know, I get half the bushels, and my tenant gets half the bushels. Or maybe I get a third of the bushels and he gets 2/3. And we agreed on that in advance. Now, you would think that in a modern economy such as ours, this kind of stuff just doesn't go on. Well, I can tell you, actually, this is the dominant form of contracting relationship in the Midwest today. So it's very much part of modern agriculture as well as developing countries. Now, what do economists who are wedded to certain ideas, restricted ideas about market data, think about all of this? Well, they say, well, this is a principal-agent contract, there's information, there's quality of inputs, degree of risk aversion, there are opportunity costs. We can write down a model which shows the optimal contract. You can read Holmstrom and Tirol and others on this question. And here's the optimal contract under these conditions. But you can see one thing that should be implied by this. There's a huge amount of heterogeneity in all of this, right? I mean, qualities, risk aversion, opportunity costs, all of those could easily be quite different across different pairs of bargaining individuals. So the theory should at least predict diversity in the outcomes. But guess what? This is very, very far from being the case. In Illinois, in the mid-90s, and I have no doubt it's still true, around 95% of all contracts were square on, half-half. Not only that, there were basically only 2 alternatives, a third or a 3/5. Okay? So it's as if people couldn't even think beyond simple fractions. In the South, this is in the northern part of the state, in the southern part of the state, actually the diagram shifts and you get concentration, as it turns out, on 3/5. What's going on here? I claim that what's going on is you're getting one of these positive feedback loops that creates a local norm that's a contracting norm that is very focal in the sense of shelling. So people can form almost, perhaps, to some sense, out of automatic, without thinking about it too much. But secondly, undoubtedly, there's some sense in which deviation will lead to possible sense of unfairness. They're not going to look at the actual incomes. That would be the economist statement about the sense of unfairness. Well, here's a really good piece of land. I'm going to give you a smaller share. Well, that's just not how people think about this. If you were to try it, you're going to get a very disgruntled tenant. You don't want a disgruntled tenant. So it's actually rational, but notice now we're using a different sense of rationality. It's rational to actually adhere to the local norm, because of all of these other nuanced, let's call them sociological/psychological feedback effects. We're talking about focal points, ease of calculation, ill will if we deviate because of some vague sense of I'm not being treated like others. People are aware of all of these things, and hence they conform. Okay, that's the basic argument. Here's an example of how broadly, the social sciences can be brought to bear on a sort of a single applied problem. So I would say this is an example of how you cross disciplinary boundaries and attack real problems with data. Is this an earth-shatteringly important problem? Well, it's not about the origins of capitalism or anything, but it's fairly fundamental to understand how contracts work. I think I'm out of time. I would have gone on to give another example about Fascinating by Kohler, Berman, and Watkins on a contraceptive uptake in rural Kenya, which I think is a marvelous study, and look it up in Demography 2001. And there it's trying to separate the two channels of why do some villages take so much longer than others to adopt contraception? Is it that people don't want to violate an existing norm, often supported by religious leaders, against contraception, i.e. you should have lots of kids? Or is it a learning story? I am uncertain. I'll wait till somebody else in the villages tries this, and then based on their experience, I'll then take it. It's a classic economic, sort of strategic delay kind of argument. That could also be working here. So anyway, this fascinating study by Kohler, Berman, and Watkins tries to get at this by looking at density of social networks as one of the predictors. And what they find is that, well, the sort of argument loosely is that if you're in a dense social network, then you might expect that the learning story is weaker and the norms story or taboo violation is stronger. If the group sort of reinforcement effect is stronger, this actually has two effects. I think this is the best part of their article, which is it first holds you back and then it accelerates it. This is precisely what they find. So that in dense networks, the community is slower to take it up in terms of frequency of adoption, but after a certain tipping point, it then accelerates very quickly because now it's become the new norm actually to adopt family planning. That's the idea. Is this proof positive that this is all correct? No. I think it's a very clever and interesting way of trying to disentangle sort of two different motivations that could be going on here, which are quite important to understand in terms of developing policy. Well, there you go. I think I've gone on too long. If you want to read a recent article on that, on the Bierman, Kohler, Watkins thing, and others, dueling, retirement, and a whole bunch of other stuff, there it is. You can go onto my website. It's a fairly long review article, sort of delving into these about 7 different cases, which I would argue I'm trying to blur the boundaries.
a very interesting talk. I would like to focus on your definition of a norm, where you said, well, some sociologists might...
And so you want
I wanted to say something. I think it would be useful also for you to make a distinction between what Hardin calls injunctive and descriptive.
Yeah.
And because, as you see in this last example, when you say the taboo actually, under certain circumstances, that stabilized the injunctive norm, was the stronger effect. People do not just look at other people and say, well, then whatever other people do is okay, but they do also, for certain things, have a feeling of obligation.
Oh, I agree with that, but
and there are actually ways of getting these two things together. Let me just give you an example. If people have a feeling of obligation of being on time for work, then that is an injunctive norm to be on time for, but there's a descriptive norm going piggyback on that, on what does it mean to be on time, so that, is it 5 minutes? So there are different local norms, that descriptive norms that go piggyback on the injunctive norm, while a counter norm of not being in time would not really make it as a descriptive norm at that moment. You see, if other people would just come late all the time, it will be at first interpreted as a deviation from the injunctive norm rather than as a piggyback.
yeah, that's a nice example, the timing norm.
And so I think some of your examples could actually make use of that distinction.
Let me just say that I think the insistence by some sociologists that norms to be norms must have an injunctive character is wrong-headed.
Okay, we're totally on that.
There are so many questions, I don't know which to take. Victor and then John.
Peyton, it seems to me that the question about mechanism is, I'd like to have you address more clearly, because it seems that there's, your view of norms comes very, very close to what in sociology is identified with social exchange theory, George Hohmann's.
Mm-hmm.
And his assumption, it is a regularity, it's a pattern, but that there are mechanisms built in networks, face-to-face interactions, that are really critical to the intensity that the norm is taken seriously by people in the network. And this has to do with reward and punishment. It comes straight out of behaviorism. And your view is also very similar to the one definition that Sonja, Opper, and I had operationalized in our research in the Yangtze Delta area, where we actually, I think Sonja developed this, took Erickson's definition of norm and measured norms in survey research. And one of the key findings in this the measurement and the test of it is that it actually is really quite important whether the norm is monitored and enforced. It's really not a norm unless someone's willing to enforce it, either in a bilateral way or through a network indirectly. And that is very clear mechanism, right? That a rule that you can't drive 50 miles an hour in a certain area, that gets enforced by the state. But the social norm, to be more than just a good belief that it leads to conformity and regularity, also has the same qualities, but it's enforced within the course of an interaction or anticipated interaction.
I knew I was going to get some pushback. I don't disagree that those mechanisms are often present, but I'm not willing to say that they are always.
But that's an empirical question.
well, I understand sociologists really just think that this is the way to go, and that if these sanctioning mechanisms are not present, then we'll call it something else, as in we'll call it a convention, and so forth. Think of sort of Coleman,
Right,
of
right.
course, emphasizing.
Convention or
I am simply taking a stand here and saying I do not personally feel that this is terribly helpful. If you read the article, you'll see that I actually bring forward some examples where it's pretty difficult to say that this is an injunctive norm or that it's working through these mechanisms of third-party punishment of any kind. But it would take way too long to try to, get into that argument here. My point that I'm trying to make is we don't need to make that assumption. To look at this more basic phenomenon of this feedback loop. And the feedback loop itself has really interesting consequences. And actually leads to predictions which are quite at odds with standard economic models, as I tried to argue with that principal agent stuff. You get this effect that I call compression. Compression arises in any of these situations. What is happening is that the individual, the heterogeneity in the group that would say lead people to optimally choose without any social interaction term, that would lead to a dispersion. You'd get some sort of a normal distribution or whatever. Compression means that through some kind of reinforcement mechanism, be it sanction or just pure conformity or some other psychological mechanism, if that's there, you're going to see a very different outcome. You get strong bunching. And slight deviations are exactly the ones you don't see. So this is a classic point about focal points, right? I mean, once you are at some kind of a norm, say half-half, the thing you will never see is 51%. This is actually related to your timing question. The norm itself casts a huge shadow on things right next to it. And I'm telling you, it is amazing how difficult it is to sell this idea to economists. I'll leave it at that. John.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.